feels like home again.
Yes, it does. So much has changed.
And so much has stayed the same. It's beautiful.
Still here after all this time.
Some things are meant to last, even in this state.
I understand the gravity of this moment, and I commit fully to our town's future.
We believe you.
He arrived with money. She stood with a town that refused to be bought. What neither of them expected was what accountability would cost.
After the storm, the Millionaire CEO learned why she refused to back down. I hope wherever you are listening from today, you can take a deep breath, relax for a moment, and allow this story to unfold slowly. Some stories are not about grand romance. Some are about healing what pride tried to hide.
Before we begin, I have a small favor to ask. Please take a second to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. It truly helps us continue bringing meaningful and dramatic stories like this one to you. And I would love to know, where are you watching from today? Share your city or state in the comments below. Now let us begin. Sometimes the deepest wounds are not caused by disaster, but by the choices people make after it. The storm had passed 3 months ago, but the town of Harbor's Edge still carried its fingerprints. Boarded up windows, salt stains climbing the sides of brick buildings, the scent of wet wood lingering in the air long after the floodwaters had retreated. It was the kind of place that did not make headlines anymore. The cameras had left. The volunteers had thinned out. What remained were the people who had nowhere else to go. Emily Carter stood inside the temporary Community Arts Center, a converted warehouse near the pier. The floor still creaked where water had warped it. The walls were covered with children's drawings, bright splashes of color against unfinished drywall. She knelt beside a folding table, helping a little boy paint a lighthouse that stood taller than the storm clouds he had drawn behind it. "Make it brighter," she said gently. "Lighthouses are meant to guide people home." Her voice was calm, steady. It had become that way out of necessity. Emily had been offered a position in Boston 2 months ago. A stable job, a clean apartment, a fresh start, far from the wreckage. She turned it down, not because she did not need the money, but because leaving would have felt like abandoning something unfinished. There is a difference between charity and commitment, and she had chosen commitment. Across town, black SUVs pulled up outside the newly reconstructed municipal building. Men in tailored shirts stepped out, clipboards in hand. At the center of them stood Daniel Carter, founder and chief executive officer of Carter Impact Group. His company had pledged $40 million toward coastal redevelopment after the storm. $40 million. For most people, that number represented salvation. For Daniel, it represented responsibility. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, scanning the damaged shoreline through tinted glass. The ocean looked peaceful now, almost apologetic. It was easy to forget what it had taken. Daniel had rebuilt ports in Louisiana, housing blocks in Florida, infrastructure in the Carolinas. Efficiency was his specialty. Measurable outcomes, scalable solutions. But as he stepped into the town hall, greeted by local officials with firm handshakes and practiced gratitude, something unsettled him. Gratitude came quickly, trust did not. Later that afternoon, Daniel insisted on visiting the neighborhoods without press coverage. No cameras, no prepared speeches, just walking. That was how he found himself standing outside the converted warehouse near the pier. Laughter drifted through the open door. Inside, children painted at folding tables, while a young woman moved between them, offering guidance and encouragement with quiet patience. He paused at the entrance. Emily looked up, brush in hand, and met his gaze. She did not recognize him immediately. To her, he was just another outsider in clean shoes. "Yes," she asked politely, wiping paint from her fingers. "I was told this was a community program," he replied. "I wanted to see how the funding was being used." Her expression shifted slightly. "It is being used to help kids process what they went through," she said. "Not just to rebuild walls." He stepped inside, taking in the artwork. Storm clouds, broken boats, but also sunrises. "You believe art can rebuild a town?" he asked. She held his gaze without flinching. "I believe people rebuild towns," she said. "And people need more than lumber." The room grew quiet. Daniel was not used to being challenged so directly, especially not by someone who had no reason to impress him. Money can restore structures, but dignity restores people. And that is something balance sheets do not measure. He nodded slowly. For the first time since the storm, he felt as though someone was not thanking him. They were questioning him, and that was far more dangerous. Neither of them knew it yet, But healing was about to demand more than generosity. It was going to demand truth. The next morning, the sky over Harbor's Edge was clear in a way that almost felt dishonest. Sunlight reflected off the water as if the ocean had never swallowed front porches, never ripped boats from their docks, never forced families onto rooftops waiting for rescue. From a distance, it looked peaceful. Up close, it was still fragile. Emily unlocked the warehouse just after 8. The air inside carried a faint mix of salt and acrylic paint. She moved slowly between the tables, straightening jars of brushes, taping down curling corners of children's drawings. A lighthouse, a broken bridge, a house standing on stilts higher than the clouds. She paused at one drawing in particular. A small figure standing in front of a giant wave, holding a paintbrush like a sword. Trauma does not disappear just because funding arrives, and it settles quietly inside people and waits to be acknowledged. She had learned that the hard way. 3 months ago, when the evacuation order came, Emily had spent 6 hours helping elderly neighbors load photo albums and prescription bottles into pickup trucks. By the time she returned to her own apartment, the streets were already flooding. She lost most of what she owned. What she did not lose was her sense of responsibility. That was why she stayed. Later that afternoon, Daniel returned to the municipal building for a closed-door meeting with local council members. Charts were projected onto a wall. Bar graphs showed progress percentages. Timelines were color-coded. Insurance payouts were cross-referenced with private capital allocations. On paper, Harbor's Edge was recovering ahead of schedule. 82% of critical infrastructure restored, one consultant reported confidently. Daniel nodded, listening, but his thoughts drifted back to the warehouse by the pier, to the young woman who had told him that people needed more than lumber. He had built his career on metrics: return on investment, impact per dollar, efficiency ratios. But something about her words unsettled the certainty he had spent years refining. After the meeting, he asked a simple question: how much of the redevelopment budget is allocated to mental health and community programs? The room fell quiet. That would fall under local nonprofit initiatives, someone replied carefully. It is not typically part of core infrastructure strategy. He leaned back in his chair. It is easier to measure buildings than to measure healing. That does not make healing less necessary. That evening, Daniel returned to the warehouse without announcement. Emily was sitting cross-legged on the floor, with 3 children helping them tape photographs onto poster boards. When she saw him at the doorway, she did not smile automatically this time. "You are back," she said. "I had more questions," he replied. She stood wiping her hands on a cloth. "About what?" "About what you think is missing." She studied him for a moment as if deciding whether he was genuinely asking or performing curiosity. "What is missing," she said slowly, "is ownership. People here feel like decisions are being made about them, not with them." He did not interrupt. "When outside investors rebuild a town," she continued, "it can feel like gratitude is expected, even when people are still grieving." The words landed heavier than any criticism he had heard in a boardroom. He had always believed he was helping, but helping and empowering were not the same thing. "Are you suggesting we are doing harm?" he asked quietly. "I am suggesting," she replied, meeting his eyes, "that if you really want this town to recover, you need to let it have a voice." The children behind her resumed laughing, unaware of the tension unfolding between 2 adults who represented very different kinds of power. Daniel looked around at the artwork again. The bright colors, the shaky lines, the stubborn hope. For the first time, he wondered whether his definition of impact had been too narrow. Real leadership is not proven by how much control you hold. It is proven by how much control you are willing to share. And something told him that if he stayed in Harbor's Edge long enough, he might have to confront more than damaged buildings. He might have to confront himself. 2 days later, Daniel requested a private walkthrough of the eastern shoreline. No staff, no media, no prepared remarks. Just him and the wind coming off the Atlantic. Emily almost declined when the town coordinator asked if she would join the visit as a community representative. She did not enjoy being placed in symbolic roles. She preferred folding chairs and paint-stained tables to structured discussions with men who wore confidence like armor. But she agreed. Not for him. For the town. They met near what used to be the public pier. The wooden planks had been torn away during the storm, leaving only steel beams rising out of the sand like ribs. Seagulls perched on them, now indifferent to human loss. Daniel arrived in rolled-up sleeves, not in a suit. It was a small detail, but she noticed. They walked along the uneven shoreline in silence at first. The air smelled of salt and damp wood. A few houses nearby were still marked with spray-painted inspection codes. This neighborhood was hit hardest, Emily said finally. Most of these families have lived here for generations. Daniel nodded. We have allocated additional funds for elevated foundations and storm-resistant materials. She stopped walking. I know, she said. That is not the issue. He turned toward her. The issue is that people are afraid this will not be their neighborhood anymore when you are done. The words lingered between them. He understood what she was implying. Redevelopment often meant improvement. Improvement often meant rising property values. And rising property values often meant displacement. Our goal is resilience, he replied carefully. Resilience for who, she asked. There was no accusation in her tone, only clarity. Rebuilding without protecting identity can become a quieter form of loss. They continued walking. A small fishing boat lay overturned in the sand. Its name faded but still visible read, Second Chance. Emily crouched beside it, brushing sand from the letters with her palm. The owner of this boat refused to evacuate until the last minute, she said softly. He said storms come and go, but home is permanent. Daniel looked at the damaged hull. Was he right, he asked. She stood slowly. He was wrong about the storm, she said, but he was right about what home means. For the first time, Daniel did not respond with data. Instead, he asked something he rarely asked anyone outside his inner circle. What would you do, he said, if you were responsible for making this town stronger? She studied him for a long moment. First, she said, I would stop making decisions behind closed doors. I would hold open forums. I would let residents vote on certain priorities, not symbolic votes, real ones. He absorbed that. And second, I would make sure no one loses their home because the rebuild made it too expensive to stay. He exhaled slowly. That is complicated, he said. So is healing, she replied. They resumed walking. In his mind, Daniel began calculating numbers, budget reallocations, legal implications, investor reactions. None of it was impossible, but none of it was simple either. He had built his company on decisive leadership, on efficiency, on knowing the answer before others finished asking the question. Now he was being asked to slow down, to listen, to share control. Power feels stable when it is centralized. It feels risky when it is shared. But only one of those creates trust. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the broken pier, Daniel realized something unsettling. He had come to Harbor's Edge believing he was the solution. Now he was beginning to see that he might also be part of the problem. And if that was true, the storm had exposed more than structural weakness. It had exposed assumptions. On both sides. That evening, a temporary stage was set up inside the high school gymnasium. Word had spread quickly that Carter Impact Group would be hosting a community listening session. Folding chairs filled the basketball court. Parents, fishermen, small business owners, retirees. Some arrived curious, others arrived skeptical. Emily stood near the back, at first arms crossed loosely, observing. She had not expected Daniel to move this quickly. She had assumed there would be internal reviews, cautious delays, carefully worded statements. Instead, there he was standing at a simple podium with no banner behind him. No oversized check. No dramatic promises. I am here to listen, Daniel began. The microphone echoed slightly in the large room. He paused, scanning the faces in front of him. Not investors, not reporters, residents. Our firm committed resources to rebuild Harbor's Edge, he continued. But rebuilding without your input would be incomplete. A murmur moved through the crowd. Listening is easy to promise and difficult to practice. The real test is what happens after the microphone is turned off. Hands began to rise. A restaurant owner asked about rising rent projections. A retired teacher asked whether insurance loopholes would leave some homes excluded from funding. A young father asked if playgrounds and schools would be prioritized over commercial redevelopment. Daniel answered carefully, but more importantly, he did not interrupt. When someone criticized outside investors for buying up tragedy, he did not defend himself immediately. He let the frustration exist in the room. Emily watched his posture, his breathing, the small tightening of his jaw when accusations sharpened. He was not immune to discomfort, but he did not retreat from it either. After nearly an hour, she raised her own hand. The room quieted as she stepped forward. You said this is a listening session, she began. So here is what I am hearing from families every day. She spoke clearly, not emotionally, but with conviction. She described parents worried about property taxes, small shop owners concerned about long-term leases, children still afraid of heavy rain. We do not just need stronger walls, she said. We need guarantees that this town will still belong to the people who built it. The room erupted in quiet agreement. Daniel met her gaze from across the gymnasium. I cannot promise perfection, he said, but I can promise transparency, starting tonight. He turned toward the council table behind him. Within 2 weeks, we will publish a full breakdown of budget allocations. We will establish a community advisory board with voting authority over certain redevelopment priorities. A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Advisory boards were common. Voting authority was not. Power shared is power transformed, but it is also power surrendered. As the meeting ended, clusters of residents remained discussing what they had heard. Some looked cautiously hopeful, others still doubtful. Emily stepped outside into the cool evening air. The parking lot lights cast long shadows across cracked pavement. Daniel joined her moments later. That was not easy, she said. It was necessary, he replied. She studied him carefully. Do you understand what you just did? She asked. I shifted some control, he said. You shifted expectations, she corrected gently. Now they will hold you to it. He nodded slowly. I expect them to. For the first time since they met, there was no tension between them. Only a shared awareness of the weight of what had begun. Inside the gymnasium, volunteers folded chairs. Outside, the ocean hummed steadily in the distance. The storm had taken roofs and docks. Now it was beginning to take something else. Assumptions about who held the final say. Healing does not begin with affection. It begins with accountability. And both of them were standing at the edge of something far more complicated than attraction. They were standing at the edge of change. 3 days after the town hall, the weather shifted again. Not into another storm, but into something heavier. A dense fog rolled in from the Atlantic, swallowing the shoreline before noon. Boats disappeared into gray silence. The air felt damp and unsettled. Emily was at the warehouse when she received the call. One of the older residents, Mr. Alvarez, had slipped while clearing debris from the back of his damaged home. He had refused to hire help, insisting he could handle it himself. Pride had outlasted the storm. By the time she arrived at the small coastal clinic, Daniel was already there. He had been touring the eastern properties when he saw the ambulance lights. Someone had recognized him and told him what happened. Mr. Alvarez lay on a narrow hospital bed with a bandaged shoulder and a fractured wrist. He was stable, but shaken. His overturned boat, the one named Second Chance, had belonged to him. Emily stood at the bedside, holding his uninjured hand while a nurse adjusted the IV line. You should not have tried to lift that beam alone, she said softly. He shrugged weakly. I did not want to be a burden. Daniel remained near the doorway watching. That word lingered in the room. Burden. After disaster, people often fear becoming dependent more than they fear the storm itself. When the nurse stepped out, Mr. Alvarez looked at Daniel with quiet recognition. You are the one with the money, he said plainly. Daniel did not deny it. Yes, he replied. Mr. Alvarez nodded toward the window. Money fixes docks. It does not fix pride. Emily glanced at Daniel, unsure how he would respond. He stepped closer to the bed. You are not a burden, Daniel said evenly, and asking for help does not make you one. Mr. Alvarez studied him for a long moment, then closed his eyes exhausted. Later outside the clinic, the fog pressed in around them. The world felt small and exposed. Emily folded her arms against the chill. This is what I meant, she said quietly. People here have spent their entire lives being self-reliant. Accepting help feels like surrender. Daniel nodded. I understand self-reliance, he said. I built my company from 1 office and 3 employees. She looked at him. Did you build it alone? He hesitated. No. She let the silence stretch. Strength is rarely solitary. It is supported even when we prefer not to admit it. That evening, Daniel made a decision that would not appear in any press release. He instructed his team to create a local labor initiative. Instead of outsourcing large portions of the rebuild to external contractors, they would hire and train residents for restoration work. Wages would remain within Harbor's edge. When his operations director questioned the efficiency of that model, Daniel responded simply, efficiency is not the only metric. Meanwhile, Emily expanded the arts program to include weekly discussion circles for adults. Fishermen who had lost boats, parents who still flinched at thunder, teenagers who pretended they were not afraid. Daniel attended one of those sessions, quietly sitting in the back. He listened as Mr. Alvarez spoke about watching the tide rise inch by inch. About realizing that wood and nails could be replaced, but memories could not. No one in the circle treated Daniel like a savior. They treated him like a participant. And for the first time, that felt right. After the session ended, Emily approached him. You did not have to come, she said. I needed to, he replied. She studied his expression carefully. You're changing the structure, she said. But are you prepared for what that costs? He understood the question beneath the question. Investor pressure, slower returns, public scrutiny. I am beginning to realize, he said slowly, that rebuilding this town might change me more than it changes it. Emily allowed herself a small, genuine smile. Healing often begins when control gives way to humility. The fog outside had begun to lift. Not completely, but enough to see the outline of the pier again. And sometimes that is how recovery starts, with visibility returning one cautious step at a time. A week after the labor initiative was announced, Daniel's phone began ringing earlier than usual. Not from Harbor's Edge, from New York. He was seated at a temporary desk inside the municipal building when his chief financial officer requested an urgent call. The tone was professional, but strained. We need to discuss exposure, the voice said through the speaker. Daniel closed the door. Go ahead. There is concern about an older coastal development fund we were part of 5 years ago. A marina expansion project 2 counties south. Environmental groups are resurfacing reports that the construction weakened natural wetlands before last season's storms. Daniel remained silent. He remembered the project. It had been legal, approved, profitable. But legality and impact were not always identical. They are connecting that model to current coastal vulnerabilities, the chief financial officer continued. If media draws a comparison to Harbor's Edge, it could complicate our position here. Complicate. That was one word for it. After the call ended, Daniel stared at the wooden desk for several long seconds. Outside volunteers carried lumber across the street. Residents discussed roofing permits. The town was slowly regaining shape, and now so was something else. A shadow. Later that afternoon, Emily sat at her small office table in the warehouse, reviewing sign-up sheets for the next discussion circle. Her laptop screen displayed a news article shared by one of the teachers. The headline referenced coastal development patterns and storm amplification. She read carefully. There it was. Carter Impact Group listed among early investors in the marina expansion. Her chest tightened, not with anger but with disappointment. She did not jump to conclusions. She read the entire article, the citations, the dates, the environmental assessments. Nothing illegal, but not innocent either. Sometimes the truth is not a dramatic scandal. It is a pattern that was once convenient. That evening, Daniel arrived at the warehouse as usual. The children had left. Folding chairs were stacked against the wall. The space felt quieter than it had in weeks. Emily stood near the window, the article open on her phone. Is it true? She asked before he could speak. He did not pretend not to understand. Yes, he said. You invested in the marina project. Yes. She held his gaze. Did you know the environmental risks? We relied on approved impact reports, he replied. At the time, the data suggested manageable disruption. At the time, she repeated. The words echoed. Growth often hides its cost inside the phrase, at the time. Daniel stepped closer, not defensively, but deliberately. I cannot undo past investments, he said, but I can reassess how we operate now. She searched his face for evasion and found none. That project may have contributed to coastal erosion patterns, she said quietly. Patterns that made storms like ours worse. He did not argue. I am aware of that possibility. The air between them shifted. This was no longer about funding community boards or hiring local labor. This was about moral continuity. Did the residents know? She asked. Not yet, he answered. Silence stretched across the warehouse. You asked for transparency, she said finally. It cannot begin only when it is convenient. Her words were not an attack. They were a standard. Daniel inhaled slowly. I will address it, he said. She nodded once, but her eyes remained steady. Addressing it means more than acknowledging it, she replied. It means accepting responsibility where it exists. He understood. Public acknowledgement would invite scrutiny. Investor backlash. Headlines that questioned both past and present. But silence would invite something worse. Hypocrisy. Healing collapses when hidden truths surface too late. As he left the warehouse that night, the wind had picked up again. Not violently, just enough to remind him how fragile coastlines could be, and how fragile credibility could be too. The storm that threatened Harbor's Edge next would not come from the ocean. It would come from disclosure, and this time there would be no evacuation order. Only choice. The announcement was scheduled for Friday evening, not in New York, not behind closed doors, in the same high school gymnasium where Daniel had promised transparency. By noon, word had spread. Some residents arrived early, whispering about the article circulating online. Others came prepared with folded printouts in their hands. Emily stood near the entrance greeting people as they walked in. She did not avoid Daniel, but she did not stand beside him either. Tonight was not about alignment. It was about truth. Daniel stepped to the podium without notes. The room quieted slowly. Before we continue with redevelopment updates, he began, voice steady but measured. There is something I need to address. A few heads lifted higher. 5 years ago, my firm participated in a marina expansion project 2 counties south of here. At the time, environmental assessments approved the development. However, recent reviews suggest the project may have contributed to coastal vulnerability patterns. A murmur moved through the gym. He did not rush. If that development amplified erosion risks, he continued, then we bear part of that responsibility. The word hung in the air. Responsibility. Not mistake, not oversight, responsibility. Leadership is tested most clearly when reputation and integrity move in opposite directions. A man in the front row stood. So you helped make storms worse, he said bluntly. Daniel did not flinch. It is possible our past investments prioritize growth without fully accounting for long-term coastal resilience. He replied, that is a failure in judgment. The directness unsettled some people more than defensiveness would have. Emily watched carefully. This was the moment she had warned him about. Addressing it meant more than acknowledging it. It meant accepting consequences. What does that mean for us? A woman called from the back. Are you pulling funding? No, Daniel said firmly. It means we are restructuring our coastal strategy entirely. Effective immediately, Carter Impact Group will establish an independent environmental review board for all future coastal investments. And we will allocate an additional $10 million toward natural barrier restoration here in Harbor's Edge. Gasps rippled through the room. But more importantly, he continued, we will publish all past coastal investment data for public review, including the marina project. Transparency was no longer selective. It was total. Emily felt something shift inside her. Not relief, not admiration. Respect. After the meeting, small groups lingered in heated discussion. Some remained skeptical, others cautiously optimistic. Outside beneath the dim parking lot, lights, she approached him. You knew investors would push back, she said. They already have, he replied. Why do it publicly? He looked toward the dark horizon, where the ocean lay unseen. Because if I expect this town to trust me, he said, I cannot protect my image at its expense. She studied his face. And if it costs you, she asked. He met her gaze. Then it costs me. Accountability is not proven by apology. It is proven by sacrifice. The wind moved through the emptying lot cooler, now less threatening. You understand this does not fix everything, she said. I know, he answered. But it is a start. For the first time since she read the article, the tension in her shoulders eased. Not because the past had disappeared, but because it had been named. And sometimes naming the truth is the first act of healing. Inside the gym, volunteers began folding chairs again. Outside, Daniel and Emily stood side by side, not as investor and critic, but as 2 people who had just witnessed how fragile and powerful honesty could be. The storm had exposed weakness. Now integrity was exposing something else. Character? The headlines did not take long to appear. Major coastal investor admits oversight. Carter Impact Group restructures environmental strategy. 10 million more for Harbor's Edge. Some articles were balanced, others were sharp. Daniel read them all. Back in New York, 2 board members requested a formal review of his decision to publish historical investment data. One investor threatened to withdraw capital from future coastal projects. The stock dipped slightly for 48 hours. In Harbor's Edge, reactions were more complicated. At the diner on Main Street, fishermen debated whether $10 million for natural barrier restoration was enough. At the grocery store, a cashier told Emily she respected the public admission, but still did not trust big money. Trust was not built in press releases. It was built in repetition. 3 weeks after the announcement, the first phase of marshland restoration began. Instead of hiring an external engineering firm to lead the work entirely, Carter Impact Group partnered with local environmental science teachers and fishermen who understood the coastline's rhythms. Daniel did not stand at the front of the effort. He worked alongside them. One Saturday morning, Emily walked toward the shoreline and saw him knee-deep in mud, helping position biodegradable erosion barriers. His sleeves were rolled up his shoes, ruined by brackish water. He looked less like a chief executive officer and more like a volunteer. She approached carefully. "You know this will not make headlines," she said. "That is not why I am here," he replied, adjusting the barrier stake. A group of high school students stood nearby, listening as a marine biologist explained how restored marshes could absorb storm surge. Daniel turned to them. "Ask questions," he said. "This is your coastline." Emily watched as the students began speaking up, not timidly, confidently. Real change is not measured by the size of the check. It is measured by who gains a voice. That afternoon, they sat on overturned buckets, watching the tide move more gently against the newly reinforced shoreline. "I spoke to the board this morning," Daniel said quietly, and she asked. "They are divided," he admitted. "Some believe we have exposed ourselves to unnecessary risk." She held his gaze. "Do you regret it?" He considered the question carefully. "I regret not questioning our past investments sooner," he said. "But I do not regret telling the truth." The wind carried the scent of salt and wet earth. For the first time since the storm, the shoreline did not look defeated. It looked intentional. Emily shifted slightly closer to him. "You understand something now," she said softly. "Healing is not charity. It is partnership." He nodded. "And partnership means I do not always lead," he replied. She smiled faintly. "Exactly." In the weeks that followed, the Community Advisory Board held its first official vote. Residents approved a mixed-use redevelopment plan that prioritized affordable housing protections and local business grants before commercial expansion. Daniel did not influence the outcome. He accepted it. Justice is not always dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a room full of ordinary people making decisions about their own future. Late one evening, as the sun lowered behind the Atlantic, Emily stood on the partially rebuilt pier. The wooden planks felt sturdier beneath her feet. Daniel joined her quietly. "I used to think resilience meant building stronger structures," he said. And now she asked, "Now I think it means building stronger relationships." She looked out at the water, calmer than it had been in months. The storm had exposed more than environmental weakness. It had exposed moral gaps. And those gaps were slowly being filled, not with money alone, but with shared responsibility. The tide rolled in gently against the restored marshline. For the first time, Harbor's Edge did not feel like a project. It felt like a community reclaiming itself, and they were both learning how to belong to it. Autumn arrived quietly in Harbor's Edge. The humidity thinned, the sky deepened into clearer shades of blue. Rebuilt rooftops caught the sunlight differently, now less like scars and more like renewal. But healing was not a single announcement or one successful restoration project. It was repetition. Daniel began spending fewer hours in New York and more time in Harbor's Edge. Not because it was strategically advantageous, but because the work felt unfinished. One afternoon, he sat inside the municipal building, reviewing updated housing protection clauses. The advisory board had insisted on a legally binding cap on property tax increases for long-term residents. His legal team had warned him. "It sets a precedent," one attorney had said. "Other towns may expect the same model." Daniel signed the revised framework anyway. Across town, Emily was leading a discussion circle for adults who had lost small businesses during the storm. The topic that week was not loss. It was rebuilding identity. "What does success look like now?" she asked the group. One man said he no longer wanted the biggest boat on the dock. He wanted stability. A mother said she wanted her children to feel safe when rain hit the roof. The answers were smaller than before, and somehow stronger. Healing changes ambition. It shifts focus from expansion to preservation. That evening, Daniel joined the group at Emily's invitation. He did not sit apart. He pulled his chair into the circle. A woman across from him spoke directly. "You admitted the past. You changed policy. But what happens when the headlines fade?" Daniel did not rush his response. "Then the work becomes quieter," he said. And more important. Emily watched him carefully. There was no performance in his tone, no corporate phrasing, just steadiness. After the session, they walked along the partially rebuilt pier. The boards felt firm under their steps. Lights reflected softly across the water. "You could go back full time," she said. "You have done more here than most would." He looked out over the marshland restoration area where new grasses had begun to take root. "I do not want to return to who I was before this," he admitted. She stopped walking. "That is a strong statement," she said. He nodded. "Before Harbor's Edge, I believed impact was primarily financial. Now I understand it is relational." She studied him in the fading light. "You are aware this town will still disagree with you sometimes," she said. "I expect it to," he replied. Respect is not the absence of disagreement. It is the presence of honesty. A gentle breeze moved across the water. Somewhere in the distance, a boat engine hummed steadily. "I never wanted to be rescued," Emily said quietly. "And I never wanted this town to be rescued either." "I know," he answered. "I wanted partnership." He met her gaze. "And that is what we built. The words did not feel romantic. They felt earned. Over the following weeks, the Independent Environmental Review Board published its first public assessment of Carter Impact Group's coastal portfolio. Some recommendations required costly restructuring. Daniel approved them. Investors who valued short-term growth began to withdraw. Others who valued long-term resilience stepped forward. Change was happening not just in Harbor's Edge, but within the company itself. One Saturday morning, as children painted new murals on the warehouse walls, Emily stepped back to observe. Daniel stood beside her. "They are painting waves again," he said. "Yes," she replied. "But notice how the waves look now." The waves in the mural were still large, but they were no longer overwhelming. They carried boats instead of crushing them. True justice is not punishment, it is restoration. The storm had exposed vulnerability. Transparency had exposed responsibility. Now consistency was building trust. And somewhere between accountability and action, something quieter had grown between them. Not dependency, not obligation, but mutual respect. The kind that does not fade when headlines do. And that, in the end, was the foundation they both needed. Winter approached without violence. No sirens, no evacuation orders, just colder mornings and longer shadows stretching across Harbor's Edge. The rebuilt pier was fully operational now. Small boats moved in and out of the harbor again. The marshland restoration had begun to thicken with new growth, green against the gray horizon. 6 months earlier, the town had measured progress in inches of floodwater. Now it measured progress in conversations. The Community Advisory Board held its final meeting of the year inside the same high school gymnasium where transparency had first been tested. Attendance was steady, not because of crisis, but because participation had become normal. Emily sat at the long table among residents reviewing updated housing reports. No one deferred to Daniel automatically anymore. They debated, they voted, they disagreed openly. And that was the point. Daniel listened more than he spoke. When a proposal passed to allocate additional funds towards small business microloans rather than expanding the marina district, he did not challenge it. He signed the approval later that week. Leadership at its strongest does not dominate the room. It strengthens the room. Outside, the ocean moved with steady rhythm, indifferent to human plans. After the meeting, Emily lingered near the gym entrance, watching families file out into the cold evening air. Children ran ahead of their parents, laughing. The building lights cast a warm glow across the parking lot. Daniel approached her quietly. "Do you remember the first night here?" he asked. "When you said you were here to listen," she replied. He smiled slightly. "I thought I understood what that meant." And now she asked, "Now I know listening is not a strategy. It is a discipline." She studied him carefully. The certainty he once carried had not disappeared. It had matured. "You changed more than policy," she said. "You changed the way your company defines impact." He nodded. "The board approved permanent environmental review requirements for all coastal projects," he said. "It will reduce short-term returns, but it will reduce long-term harm." She let out a quiet breath. "That matters." They walked toward the pier together. The air was sharp, but calm. Lights reflected off the water in long, trembling lines. "I used to believe storms were interruptions," Daniel said. "Something to endure before returning to normal." And now she asked, "I think storms reveal what normal was hiding." She stopped at the edge of the rebuilt dock. The wood felt solid beneath her boots. "I never wanted someone to save this town," she said softly. "I wanted someone willing to be accountable to it." He met her gaze. "And I never wanted admiration," he replied. "I wanted repeat." Silence settled between them. Not awkward, not uncertain. Earned. Love, when it grows in the right soil, is not built on rescue. It is built on respect. The relationship that had formed between them was not dramatic. There were no grand declarations shouted into the wind, no promises made under fireworks. There was partnership, shared decision-making, mutual correction, honest disagreement, quiet support. As the tide rolled in gently beneath the pier, Emily slipped her hand into his. Not because she needed stability, but because she chose it. He did not pull her closer possessively. He simply held her hand steady. Behind them, Harbor's Edge was no longer a symbol of destruction. It was a case study in accountability, a reminder that money without humility can cause harm. And humility without action is not enough. Healing does not erase the storm. It transforms what follows it. The ocean would rise again someday. Storms would return. That was inevitable. But this time, Harbor's Edge would face them differently, with stronger structures, with shared authority, with leaders who understood that justice is not about appearing right, but about choosing to be responsible. And for Daniel and Emily, the future was no longer about rebuilding what was lost. It was about protecting what had been restored, together.
Thank you so much for being here with me. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. More stories are already waiting on your screen. Pick one and I'll see you.